Hi, everybody. My name's Jerry Naunheim. I'm a local commercial photographer. I worked at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for 25 years as a photojournalist. I'm a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism. So I was asked to put together a little presentation for you, and I'm going to do that. And I'm a little unfamiliar with this software, so I'm going to do my best and try to give you a presentation. So, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. As I said before, I worked at the Post-Dispatch for 25 years. I traveled all over the world. I covered social unrest in South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Angola for the Post-Dispatch. I covered the war in Bosnia in the 90s, and I covered many, of course, local and national events for the Post-Dispatch. So that's a little bit about my history. Um, I'm going to start with some slides. I have several different categories here. The first one I call joie de vivre, which means in French the joy of life. It's really kind of my favorite thing to photograph. It just means people having a good time. I think there's an awful lot of sadness and disarray in journalism, and sometimes my vision of life is a little lighter, and I like to try to show that to the readers. So this first slide is just some little girls playing at a preschool, and the little girl, the second one from the right, is my daughter Rosie. This is that same preschool. It's run by an order of nuns called the Carmelites of the Divine Heart of Jesus. And we decided to do a little story about this particular convent because they had so many young girls, all wearing habits and much more traditional than what we think of today as nuns. And we thought that would be a good story about why would young girls join an order of nuns. So really, I'm just going to move through these slides a little bit, just to show a little bit of the joy of life. This one is actually my son out in front of our house. This one is my 3 children when they were babies. And this is my daughter meeting her baby sister for the very first time. So I'm just going to kind of go through these a little bit quickly. Unfortunately, some of these are kind of small and others are larger, and I don't know why, but it's just the way it is. I even shoot a few weddings. This was one of the Post-Dispatch reporters. One thing I love about weddings, I try to shoot them in a photojournalistic style, and I try to capture that moment. And this was the first moment they saw each other as she walked into the courtyard in her wedding dress. And I think in this one you can just see the love in this man's face for his bride. One thing I like to do in almost all situations, I try to shoot the action, but I also look around to see how people are reacting to the action. So even if I were shooting a fire or if I were shooting a happy event, I also look around to try to see how are people reacting to that event. Again, I do a lot of photography involving people at work. So even at work, I try to really show people having a good time if they are having a good time. If not, I try to show them acting the way they normally act, just to be true to the story. And I'm just going to kind of run through these a little bit. One thing I like to do is zoom in on people's faces, and I use a shallow depth of field and a long lens because I think that's a really good way of zooming in on a person's personality. This was the last day of school. The school closed this day, and this is one of the teachers, or I think it was actually the school nurse, saying goodbye to one of the students. This is actually another wedding, and I really don't do very many weddings, but there's a lot of joy in those weddings, and the joie de vivre comes through pretty well when people are having a good time. This was one of the celebrations of I think St. Louis Cardinals winning the World Series, if I recall. And this is the former mayor of St. Louis. Again, focusing in, I try to really spend a lot of time with my subjects. I try to watch them. I shoot hundreds of pictures of each person. And again, you've probably heard it said before that there's an old saying, a amateur photographer takes one picture and hopes it turns out, and a professional photographer takes a lot of pictures and then picks the best one. And that's what we all do. So I'm always in the search for this, always looking for people having a good time, because I think, as much bad as there is in the world, there's a lot more good going on. We just don't do much coverage of that in the news. But for every person who gets killed, there's millions of people who didn't get killed. And for every person who kills somebody, there's millions and millions of people who didn't kill anybody. There's just a lot of real goodness in life. And that's kind of my favorite thing to photograph. I do a lot with schools. This was the story about the stock market going through the roof. Again, I'm just anticipating things. I'm watching people, and if I see that they're expressive, I'll keep my camera trained on them and see what happens. This is one of the little small ones. This one is actually a job I did for Washington University. It's not real. It's one of my new commercial jobs where I set everything up so there was lights set up. The whole thing was acted out, so it's not exactly photojournalism, but it is something I do now. This is one of the pictures I took in Bosnia. These children were running around all over the place asking for American dollars or Deutschmarks. But even in this bombed out, terrible place where all this ethnic cleansing was going on, there was some joy. And when I do my international trips, I generally try to find out how people in the society are treating their children. So in Bosnia and all over Africa, I tried to find children to show how they're dealing with it. Sometimes it was bad, sometimes it was good, but always it's truthful. I also used to do a lot of fashion for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I don't really do that much anymore, but these are some of the stills I shot, but I've also gone to New York quite a few times and shot Fashion Week. But these are all ones that were set up here in St. Louis. Again, I'm trying to focus on beautiful light. This was, and of course, the clothes and the expressions and the posing is important. This we actually shot in a big freezer, and it was literally freezing cold in there. But I brought in lights, and I had to worry about fogging up my lenses, but it turned out okay. This is actually more of a photo illustration I did. Each one of these pictures was shot separately, and then I cut it out and placed it on a white background. Just a little more fashion. I also did a lot of food photography for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. This was one I did. I wish it was bigger to show you, but we painted the grass green with green paint, and I painted the basket green. And then I tried to, connect the color a little bit. So there's this red vein shooting up through the, I guess it's Swiss chard. And then I put the little tomatoes down there to try to carry that red across. And then we put a little frame around it to make it look like it was actually shot on 2¼ film, which it wasn't. This was kind of a funny one. I had to go find a little chick to do this picture. I can't tell you the truth, I can't remember what the story was exactly. But I called the Humane Society in a couple of places, and they wouldn't let me borrow any chicks because it was a food story. I said, I'm not going to eat the chick. This is just to show the chick with some eggs. So I got this little chick at a farm down in Fenton, and I brought it up and put this picture together. It's actually shot on a big black piece of black plastic, which provided the reflection, and then I used a orange filter on the backlight and bounce that onto onto a black backdrop, which the black fades out to the right and left, and the hot spot is nice and red in the middle. This is shot on that same piece of black plastic that's very reflective, and it makes a nice picture for food. This is one, again, I wish it were bigger for you to see. It was a story on root beer, so I got, I don't know, 100 bottles of different brands of root beer, and I shot each picture individually, and then in Photoshop I built this whole tall bottle out of these tiny little bottles, and I'll tell you, it was a challenge. Here's another food shot. That's actually my grandfather in his World War II uniform up in the right. But I shot this in my dining room. I put all this together, and then I used one of the Photoshop filters to make it look a little bit more like a painting. This is over at the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. They had something called an ice bar, and the bar itself was actually frozen. And these were the different drinks you could order. Just a nice picture of some raspberry jam. Here's a cake. Again, I'm always trying to use directional lighting, shoot from the right or shoot from the left. That shows the texture of the food. Actually, most of the time with food, I'm shooting with the light a little back behind it. And that seems to give it a nice shadow in the foreground and then a little hot spot in the background. I also did a number of photo illustrations with food. This one all about salsa. So clearly I spelled out salsa with the ingredients of salsa. And here was one for fireworks. I made this fireworks display out of pieces of onion and hot peppers and green peppers, and then little pieces of seed from the hot pepper. And this is how it ran. We had a very nice food page that won many awards in those days. We had a very good designer and a very good editor. This was one about different types of honey, and I was playing around with the bottles on the desk back in the photo department, and I set one of the bottles down and I realized how the light was going through it. So I set this up with the sunlight coming through it. I shot it, and then I actually turned the picture upside down because the light was actually coming from the other direction. And it turned into a pretty nice picture. Nice graphics that shows a representation of the bottles and the honey rather than the honey itself. And this was a tricky one. The story was all about people who were very, very particular about their food. So I put this together with hundreds and hundreds of blue M&Ms. The idea being that even with all that, this person just wants that one red M&M. Another thing I did at the Post-Dispatch, I did quite a bit of gardening photography, and I really enjoyed doing that. I would we'd have a photo contest actually every year, and I would get up really, really early in the morning, and I would usually get there about 6 o'clock, and I would spend, a couple hours before the sun got bad, just really being quiet and taking beautiful pictures and trying to find beautiful patterns in the plants. I'd also find some animals, and I just really enjoyed doing it. It was so different from what I do sometimes, which is covering disasters and other things like that. Sometimes it's so nice just to be able to have some peace and shoot something beautiful. So I actually did this every year for quite a few years for our annual photo contest. I would really just shoot the winners. And I don't think I have many slides here of the actual people, but I actually would shoot the winners also. Again, here just trying to capture the beautiful light, trying to find the contrasting colors of yellow and purple. Every once in a while I'd get pretty lucky, and I got this with these goldfinches in the picture with the flowers themselves. Once in a while a dog wandered in. These are just some of the greens and blues and purples and different colors. I also always enjoyed humor in photography, which I think I mentioned in some of the critiques of your photos. This kid was playing basketball, talking on a phone. This is before the days of cell phones, actually, but it was a cordless phone. And I was driving around and I saw this kid jumping up and down, and I thought, now that's funny. So I photographed this, and it ran in the Post-Dispatch. Here's another one. Again, sometimes in photography, we're looking for juxtaposition. And I remember in journalism school, sometimes they called this thing pairing for the third effect, which means there's 2 or 3 different elements, but when you put them together, you get a whole new effect. Well, this man was sitting in a bus stop and smoking, and I looked up, and it looked like the smoke was going right up into the face of this girl. She was actually just a poster, but it was kind of a funny shot, I thought. Again, sometimes funny little parallels. This was a story I spent quite a bit of time doing on a girl's senior year in high school. And she lived on a dairy farm. She had 8 or 9 brothers and sisters, and they worked really hard all day, on weekends early in the morning, and they went to school. So I spent several weeks with her off and on in the family, and then later on I photographed her going to her prom. Again, even in sports, there's a little bit of humor. I thought this was kind of funny. Maybe a kid with a gun's not so funny to everybody, but this boy, he only had a toy gun, luckily. His brother was fishing, and he was just going to point the gun at the people. I mean, at the animals and the fish and the goose. This is this is an example of a shot where most of the time when we take a picture of somebody, we're trying to avoid things coming out of their head. But this is one of the other Post-Dispatch photographers, Teague Phillips, and he didn't know I was doing this. But I had him turn and go this way and go that way, and he didn't know I was putting those antennae coming out of his head. This was just a found situation. I was driving around actually with an intern and kind of telling him about what I do every day, and I was just shooting features, and I came across this giant Great Dane, and he almost looks like a gargoyle on a building, and he looked a little intimidating, and I was very close to him. You can tell I'm using a wide-angle lens, but he seemed friendly enough, and it turned out to be kind of a nice picture. This is a category of slides that I call photo illustration, where the whole thing is completely controlled by the photographer. And we're very careful at the newspaper that a photo illustration has to look like it's a photo illustration. You can't set something up and fake it and then just call it a photo illustration. It has to really be clear to the reader that this is something that wasn't actually happening. So I was photographing this guy who was a marathon or Ironman runner. So I splashed water in his face for the left picture. I shot him straight on in front of the bike and then running towards back into the frame as a runner. And you can see I used a little effect here with a flash and then a slow shutter pan. So when he moved a little bit, it left this cool shadow on the back that gave it a little bit of feeling for motion. And that's how that's done. This is a story on slow cookers. So I set the whole thing up. It's 3 different pictures combined to look kind of like a nuclear power plant. This is one, oh, I can't even really tell you what it was about. It was about, oh, I know. It was about rockers. So I went to a furniture store, and this is actually a combination of the actual painting called Whistler's Mother and a real person. So part of it where her face is the actual lady, but the background is the painting. And the place where she has her feet at the bottom, that's part of the actual painting, but obviously the tennis shoes are hers. This was one of my favorites, and a lot of people really liked it. This was a photo illustration on this lawyer who was a basketball star. So I'm showing you this in two phases. This was the first part I took, thinking ahead on how I was going to use this later. So I got up on a ladder and I shot it from above. And I had him open his shirt up, and you can see in this picture there's little pins in there. But I wanted to be able to see a jersey under there, but he forgot the jersey. So later on, I combined this with the cloud picture, and I put the arch back there, and then I photoshopped in his jersey. Turned out pretty nicely, I think. This is actually me and my daughter. She's 21 years old now, and I photographed her sitting on my lap in the studio, and then I took a picture of the moon, and I sat us on top of it. And this was around our house for quite a while, and my daughter used to say, "Daddy, do you remember that time we jumped up on the moon?" She actually thought this was a real picture, and she actually had a memory of having jumped up there with me. Again, just these are kind of fashion photos that turned into photo illustrations, and I just wanted to show you a little bit about how some of this stuff was handled by our excellent designers at the Post-Dispatch. This was a pocket guide for Busch Stadium. I put this whole thing together, but unfortunately, someone in the newsroom didn't think this was appropriate. But I thought it was, and it was kind of a takeoff on Bruce Springsteen's album cover. But it was poo-pooed by one of the women in the sports department, and it never ran. This is a category I just call pictorial. Sometimes in photojournalism, we get to do some fancy stuff that doesn't, it may tell a story, it may not, but sometimes they're just beautiful images. And this is taking a carriage ride through the park on Christmas at one of the parks in St. Louis County. This is a story I did about the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis. This was a whole exhibit on neon. But I thought it was just strange, and these people actually just happened to walk by, and it really kind of added to the picture, I think. Oops. Well, this one should be upright, but it is not. There's nothing I can do about it now. This a little series of stories on quality of light. This was over in Forest Park. They were putting together these little luminaries. It's shot with a very, very slow shutter, obviously, but it's nothing set up here. I'm very careful never to direct a person to do it, so I had to shoot quite a few pictures of different people holding these things because the shutter speed was so slow. If people moved a little bit even, it would be blurry. This is another one I did with quality of light. It's really, the way I did it, I had all the lights turned out. I had the girl walk through with a sparkler, and then I turned the light. I used a flash, actually. I flashed her from the left, and then I switched the light behind her on and off. So there's really three parts to putting this together. This was over at, I believe, the St. Louis Science Center. This is another thing I did to show motion. So I was perched on a building high in downtown, and there were these people going in and out of the stadium. I think it was around the time of a parade for a World Series. So I did a really super, super slow shutter, probably a minute or 45 seconds. So some of the people really didn't move at all, and that gave a feeling of stillness. But a lot of people were moving in and out, and it gave it this really kind of beautiful flowing motion. Again, now we're into sports. It's just a found situation, kids playing in an alley in St. Louis. This was a little tricky one to shoot. It was a bike race, and I saw these guys sitting there, so again, I did a very slow shutter speed, although it's not that slow. It's probably a 30th of a second. But I kept shooting and shooting and shooting, hoping to get them right in the center. And at a certain point, these two bikes went by at just the right time, and I caught that motion. These are some dancers doing this very scary and dangerous ballet hanging from ropes down in the Grand Theater District. And well, we've already seen this one, haven't we? That's that same picture, but a little bigger. I'm also going to show you some sports. I did quite a bit of sports photography at the Post-Dispatch. I covered the Cardinals, the Blues, the football Cardinals, the St. Louis Rams, the Steamers, just about every sports team that ever came through St. Louis. I photographed them. I photographed many World Series and playoffs games. It was one of the great joys to me of journalism, was getting to photograph lots of Cardinals. This is Ozzie Smith doing his flip. Now some of these, they seem to be a little bit out of order, and I did have to throw this together. So this was a story I did on weightlessness. These students were doing stories in a weightless environment. So we went in this airplane called the Vomit Comet, which did these great big hyperbolic dives and climbs. And as you go over the top and start to descend, you were actually falling at the same rate as the speed of gravity. So we would actually go weightless for about 30 seconds. It was really fun, and I had to go through a lot of training down at Cape Kennedy, or maybe, it was Cape Kennedy or Cape Canaveral, down in Houston. So I did also cover difficult situations. It's a little bit hard to read when it's this small, I think, but the woman in the middle there was just rescued from a carjacker who kidnapped her at a bank. And we got the call, hey, is anybody near this place? So we were calling back on our radios, and I was driving all around trying to find out where this chase was going to end. And I went into a neighborhood that I kind of knew. I ended up having to park my car, jump over a high fence, run across traffic on Highway 70, jump across a median, and run across a second line of traffic. And I shot this picture with my 300 millimeter. And it was one of the first pictures I ever took with a digital camera. I was one of the first at the Post-Dispatch to go full digital. And that's what this is. And it ended up okay, and the lady was rescued and the man was arrested. This was some of the stuff I shot in Bosnia. I did quite a few stories there. I wrote some and photographed many. This was me. I was shooting from inside this safety zone where the whole air base was surrounded by razor wire, but these people were stuck outside. I was in a safe area. They were stuck outside in a danger area. This was an American soldier. So what I tried to do in Bosnia was find Americans, and particularly St. Louisans, and this was a St. Louis soldier. And these two little boys are just watching this soldier, trying to figure out, is this a good guy or a bad guy? Fortunately for them, it was a good guy. Just a little more joie de vivre here. As I said, I do a lot of schools. I love to shoot children. I think they say so much about a society, and they're so innocent and loving, and their expressions are always so wonderful, and they're so exciting and excitable. Just a little story, another parade in St. Louis. I have a section here too. I think this is actually the pictorial section. I did a series of pictures for Forest Park Forever. Now my alarm's going off here. And these are just some pretty pictures I shot. These are shot with a wide angle. Some are shot with a telephoto. Oh no, here we go again with this same picture. I gotta tell you folks, I just had to throw this together at the last minute. I'm locked in my house because of the COVID virus, and I have no work, but I'm doing my best to try to find ways to make a living. So I'm spending a lot of time filling out forms. so please bear with me. These are just some uh, visuals that I thought were pretty. This is downtown. This is at the Pulitzer. This is one of the Sarah sculptures. This is actually St. Louis Priory, where I went to high school for a few years and then didn't go there anymore. But I still love the place, and I thought this was beautiful, and it was particularly nice in black and white. It's a photographer's dream, this church. It's so beautiful and so unusual. Here's some more pictorials. Some more of the stuff I shot for Forest Park Forever. I really love doing nature and running around and watching animals and birds and trying to do nice compositions. This is another one. People ask me, how did you do this? Because every time we try to shoot it, it gets overexposed or underexposed. And the trick is to do it at just the right time of night. You want the light from the fountains to be balanced with the light outside. And then you can get a nice picture without it being too dark around one and too light at the fountains. These are just some photos of Forest Park. Different angles, different views, trying to use color. This is a this is a little misleading. It's kind of an interesting picture. It almost looks like two people walking away to heaven. But this is actually a nuclear waste dump over in Weldon Springs, where all this nuclear waste from this thing is buried under this mountain of gravel. And just some more visuals. Use of color, composition. I usually try to get people in there somewhere. That's really a big part of photojournalism, is having people in there. This is pretty, but I think the person down in the lower left corner with the dogs really adds to it. Just gives you a better feeling of scale and just gives you a feeling for actually being there. And now this is just a series of portraits. This was a story I did on the Pink Sisters, who were an order of nuns. They live a totally secluded life, and they dress in pink to represent the joy and the Holy Spirit. If they ever do come out, they dress in gray. But this story became kind of a big deal. I spent maybe 2 or 3 days back within the convent photographing things where no man has gone before. And later on, they prayed and prayed and prayed for good weather for the Pope, and then the TV station got a hold of it, and it turned out to be kind of a funny situation for the sisters. They became famous based really just on this picture. This is just another nice portrait. David Halen, who's the concertmaster at the St. Louis Symphony. I did quite a bit of freelance work for the symphony. I got to travel all over the world with them. I would take a leave of absence from the Post-Dispatch. Then I traveled to Europe with them twice and to Japan, just kind of documenting the tours. This lady was a survivor of the Holocaust, and she was a poet laureate, I believe, or not a Pulitzer Prize winner, but can't think of the name of it right now. The one that Mother Teresa won, the Peace Prize. Again, this is another Post-Dispatch reporter whose wedding I covered. Again, part of what I try to do with portraits is if there's more than one person, I try to separate them in a couple different levels to give it some depth of field. These are some pictures I took for a law firm. I work for Armstrong Teasdale. This is actually Judge Limbaugh, who is Rush Limbaugh's cousin. Again, I try to work with people and make them comfortable. That's an important part of doing portraits, is making people feel comfortable and at ease with you, and then you can catch those good expressions. Just keeping up with a series of portraits here. Just trying to catch that soft look, trying to catch a personality, trying to make a person look and feel comfortable. I love to shoot people's faces. They say so much about the person's personality. And this is a series of portraits I did called Ageless Remarkable St. Louisans. And these are all people in St. Louis who are over 75 years old. And I did a big series of portraits of them for their awards, all in black and white. And then later I put these together in frames with text under them, and this was kind of a traveling portrait show for a while. I love doing this. My favorite things to do are photograph old people and young people. So all these are obviously set up portraits. I'm trying to get this done a little quickly for you so you don't get bored. So I may be going too fast on these, but I think you get the picture. Literally get the picture. I actually do quite a bit of portraits now. As a commercial photography, that's a big part of my job. I even do some family portraits. This was a series of pictures I did for the Post-Dispatch. It was kind of based on the movie Men in Black. So I went around and took a whole bunch of pictures of different people who actually dress in black. So I did a judge, I did a priest, I did some karate guys. It was really a fun thing, and each one of them wore Men in Black glasses. Sometimes the detail of a person's face isn't the most important thing. Sometimes it's just their hands. And sometimes I'll do both the hands and the faces. Again, I try to put the people at different levels to give it some depth and some interest. There's a group of musicians. Here's kind of a really good example of where I do that level. This was a jet aviation thing up in New York. They flew me up there to do a portrait of these people. So I put them in small groups of 2s, 3s, and 4s, and then put them at completely different levels to give it that real good 3D look. Now I'm just going to show you a few portraits here and how they were used later. This is how I shot it. This is how it was used with added type for publication for Washington University. So this is the original. And then sometimes they crop them a little bit to put the type in, which is okay with me because I get paid. This is another series of portraits I did for the electric company. And they originally had a designer decide how to do this, and she showed me a bunch of pictures, and I thought, this is all too dark. Why don't you just get some t-shirts, we'll put the type on there, and I'll shoot it in a bright situation. So I set all these up in a studio. And this is Ralph Butler, a famous St. Louis musician. This is Tom Schlafly, who owns Schlafly Beer. I also do some portraits of musicians for the St. Louis Symphony. This is Allison Harney, one of the violinists. There's a bunch of monks from Priory. And then Kay Quinn from KSDK. And another portrait of one of the musicians for the St. Louis Symphony. Back to a little bit of sports. This is Mark McGwire signing autographs when he was working on his record-setting home run. He was such a gracious player at that time, signing autograph after autograph after autograph. Again, I mentioned in one of the critiques that good sports action also depends pretty heavily on facial expression. So it's also the interplay of the bodies and the action, but we like to see the faces and how people are reacting to sports and to the stress of the environment. This is Mark McGwire hitting his record-tying 62nd home run. Or this might have been the 63rd home. No, the 62nd home run was the record breaker, I believe. This is just a little series of work called Men at Work. Or not Men at Work. pardon me ladies, people at work. I do quite a bit of that. This is for a company I work for called Jet Aviation. Again, I try to show the concentration on the people's faces. I don't really set anything up, although this isn't photojournalism to speak. I do show it in a photojournalistic way. Just people working, trying to find different ways to look at it. This I'm actually climbing inside the innards of an airplane. Sometimes I light it myself. This is a blue light I added, but I also added a neutral light to focus in on the subject and give it that kind of high-tech feel. So one of the professors at WashU. This is St. Louis Children's Choir. Again, looking for those expressions, always trying to find the expression in people's faces. People at work, always trying to find a good angle. I had to climb up as high as this guy to do this. Now I use a drone. I could shoot this picture without having to endanger my life. Again, when I'm shooting, I'm always shooting for story. I'm shooting loose, tight, overalls. I don't mean overalls that I wear overalls. I mean I'm shooting the scene in an overall fashion. Doing details. This picture I actually had to climb down the sewer to take a picture of. It wasn't nice. This is the St. Louis visit of the Pope John Paul II. This is his Mass. This was one of the early days of digital photography, and the amazing thing about this is I got to shoot this picture. I handed it off to a runner. The runner ran it up the street to the Post-Dispatch, and by the time the Mass was over, they were selling newspapers with pictures that I had just taken on the front page before they even came out. It was amazing. I also do a little bit of aerial photography. These are all shot with helicopters, but now I have a drone and I can do it with a lot less cost. These were like $600 an hour to fly these for the Post-Dispatch. I can take my drone out and do the same thing for a fraction of the cost. And that's about it. I'm going to wrap it up. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this and to watch, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to call me or email me with any questions. Again, it's Jerry Naunheim Jr. My email is jerry@jerrynaunheim.com. And my cell phone is 314-393-0509. Thanks again.